Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. Glad you've joined me for Lesson 7 in my 13-part series on asking and answering basic questions in Spanish. In this lesson, Lesson 7, I'm going to focus on how to ask and answer questions pertaining to people's jobs, professions, how they make a living. But before we do that, let me remind you about the other topics covered in this series. Okay, you can see from this slide where today's lesson fits into the overall sequence and what the other topics are. I recommend viewing the entire series in order, since I've designed it so that the vocabulary and grammar structures build on each other in terms of complexity. Alright, let's go to the whiteboard for our discussion of the questions and answers for today's lesson. Alright, let's start with the simplest and most common way to ask whether or not somebody works, simply with the question, ¿Trabajas? Trabajas? Again, it is a yes or no question. Let's start with possible negative responses first, right? Of course, if you don't work, you can just say, no, no trabajo. Right? Basic negative response. No, repeated, plus the verb, right? No, no trabajo. Or you might say something like, no estoy trabajando en este momento. Right? No estoy trabajando en este momento. I'm not working at the moment or currently. Or you might say, en este momento estoy sin trabajo. So, right now, I'm without a job. So these are ways we can answer sort of in the negative. If we do have a job, we have several options, right? ¿Trabajas? Sí. Soy. What I'm going to do here is I'm using a form of the verb ser, to be, and I'm just going to add the actual profession. Okay, this is one of the simplest ways to answer this question. Sí. Soy, por ejemplo, soy profesor. That's how I would answer this question. Soy profesor. Someone else might say, soy contador. Contador. Accountant. Or soy cocinero. Or soy enfermero. Soy mecánico. I just sort of chose 5 professions more or less at random. Now, before you say, oh, that Professor Jason, he's such a sexist. Soy profesora, if I'm a woman. Contadora, female accountant. Cocinero, a cook, could easily be cocinera. Enfermero is often a woman, enfermera, but we do have male nurses. And mecánico, you don't see a lot of female mechanics, but just, of course, those could be men or women, right? So, first option, sí, soy profesor, soy contadora, soy cocinero. We're using soy plus the actual profession. You could easily Google, find a list of professions in Spanish, right? Just Google something like profesiones en español, and you should be able to find lots of handouts and websites where they list, many, many more professions. Soy profesor, soy mecánico. So that's option number 1, right? Sí, soy plus profession. Another way to answer this is to say, sí, trabajo como. Trabajo como. This is almost identical to the form we just saw. Sí, soy. So you're just going to, again, I shouldn't have erased these because you're going to say, trabajo como profesor. Or trabajo como contador. Trabajo como cocinero, cook. Trabajo como enfermera, nurse. Trabajo como mecánico, right? So, sí, trabajo como. Or you could say, a third way would be, replace como with en, right? Trabajo en, to say where you work at, right? Trabajo en, por ejemplo, una escuela, si soy profesor. Trabajo en una escuela. Trabajo en una oficina. For example, oficina, an accountant. Trabajo en una oficina. What about the cook or the chef? Trabajo en un restaurante. Trabajo en un restaurante. the nurse, the doctor, right? The physician's assistant. Trabajo en un hospital o en una clínica. Okay? Mecánico, sí. Trabajo en un taller. So again, a perfectly acceptable way to answer this question. Trabajas, so far we've seen sí, soy mecánico. Or sí, trabajo como mecánico. Or the third option, sí, trabajo en un taller. Okay? All perfectly legitimate ways to answer. Let's look at one more. This one is sort of, I call this my escape mechanism, right? If you really, for some reason, can't remember some specific piece of vocabulary, oops, that's one we just saw, you can go for the most generic and just say, I work with, right? So, for example, if you're a professor and for some reason you can't remember the job title, you could just say, sí, trabajo con estudiantes. Or maybe you do something that's a little bit different. You're not a professor. Maybe you're an assistant in a learning lab, right? You could just say, sí, trabajo con estudiantes. Or you might say, you might be an assistant to an accountant, right? Or part of an auditing team. But if you don't know how to say that, you can just say, sí, trabajo con números. Trabajo con números. You're a cocinero, but you can't remember how to say restaurante or cocinero or chef. So you might just say, oh yeah, comida. Sí, trabajo con comida, right? Enfermero, enfermera, doctor. Trabajo con personas enfermas. Again, this is a strategy that may or may not always be appropriate, but you can try it. Un mecánico, sí, trabajo con autos or con coches or carros or camiones, right? Depending on how you want to say that. So what we've seen so far in terms of how to answer that question, trabajas, we've seen 4 variations, all equally valid. Sí, soy plus profession. Sí, soy profesor. We've seen sí, trabajo como, right? Trabajo como profesor. We've seen sí, trabajo, and then en, or at, right? En una universidad, or una escuela, and then we've seen trabajo con, which you can get a lot of mileage out of this one here. Sí, trabajo con. Trabajo con dinero. Trabajo con números. Trabajo con personas. Trabajo con comida, right? So, all right, those are ways to answer in the affirmative. A related question might be, ¿en qué trabajas? ¿En qué trabajas? Which sort of loosely translated would be, what do you work with, right? What do you do at your job? And again, some of these would work. Trabajo como, or trabajo en, or trabajo con, right? So, ¿en qué trabajas? I might say, trabajo con estudiantes, o soy profesor. You can basically answer this question in any of these 4 ways as well. You just don't need the sí. ¿En qué trabajas? Soy enfermero. Trabajo como enfermero. Trabajo en un hospital. Trabajo con pacientes o personas enfermas. Right? ¿En qué trabajas? What do you do? What do you do for a living? Right? By the way, another question that I didn't make a card for, but is very colloquial and comes up a lot, right? ¿A qué te dedicas? Dedicas. Okay? ¿A qué te dedicas? Literally, to what do you dedicate yourself? Means, right? More freely translated, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living? And again, any of these 4 approaches would work. ¿A qué te dedicas? Soy profesor. Trabajo como profesor. Trabajo en una universidad. O trabajo con estudiantes, okay? Y exámenes, whatever. Okay. ¿En qué trabajas? ¿A qué te dedicas? Different ways to ask the same question. All right. Another question having to do with work, more specific, just might be, ¿dónde trabajas? ¿Dónde trabajas? And here, you're going to want to begin with trabajo, and 9 times out of 10, trabajo en. If you hear yourself in English thinking at, in this particular context with work, it's going to be en. Trabajo en, right? So if you happen to work at Walmart, you're going to say, somebody asks, ¿Dónde trabajas? You're going to say, trabajo en Walmart. Trabajo en Walmart, okay? Now, with this particular question, there's different ways to answer it. You can be more or less, right, specific or general. ¿Dónde trabajas? I might say, trabajo en un hospital. O trabajo en una clínica. O trabajo en una oficina. We saw some of these with the previous question. Oficina. That's kind of vague, kind of generic, right? Or I could be more specific. If the person knows I'm a doctor, the person just doesn't know which hospital or clinic I work at, right? I might say, trabajo en el hospital San Lucas. Just made that up on the fly, right? So again, that sort of shows you the difference between an indefinite and a definite article, being more specific, referring to an actual place, right? ¿Dónde trabajas? Trabajo en el Hospital San Lucas. I could even be as vague as to just say the city or the state where I work, right? ¿Dónde trabajas? Just depends on the context, right? Trabajo en, and then even the state, right? California. Say we're at a convention or something like that, and we're all doctors, but I get this question. ¿Dónde trabajas? Trabajo en California. And then if they want something more specific, they'll ask, ¿En serio? ¿En qué hospital? En el Hospital San Lucas. Okay, so that's in terms of where. ¿Qué haces en el trabajo? ¿Qué haces en el trabajo? More specific question about what activities do you actually do at work, right? Again, you can take the more generic approach that we saw before. Trabajo con, right? Trabajo con dinero. Trabajo con niños. Say you're a daycare provider, right? Trabajo con niños. Trabajo con números. Trabajo con comida. Another approach to answering this question, and probably the one that the interviewer, if this is a test situation, wants you to take, is to use the present tense verb, right? And just to say which activities you do. So for example, if you work in a department store, you might say, and somebody asks, ¿Qué haces en el trabajo? You might say, vendo, right? I sell something. Vendo ropa y zapatos, right? Or if you are a mechanic and you work at a taller, an auto body shop or a shop, you might say, arreglo coches, right? Arreglo coches. Or if you're a professor, you might say, enseño varias clases. I teach several classes, right? Varias clases. Point is, you're using the present tense yo form of the verb, and you're just listing the activities that you do. ¿Qué haces en el trabajo? Vendo ropa y zapatos. Arreglo coches. Enseño varias clases. All right? So just use the present tense verb. ¿Con quién trabajas? ¿Con quién trabajas? Again, we're going to use the verb in the present tense. We're going to recycle this preposition right here, and it's a quién, tells us about the participants. With whom do you work? Trabajo, again recycling the verb, same tense, same verb. Con, bringing down that preposition, and then it's wide open. Well, who do you work with, right? With whom do you work? Trabajo con, maybe it's a family business. Mis padres, o con mi hermano. Or maybe you work with some friends. Trabajo con algunos amigos. Or trabajo con varios colegas del trabajo o de trabajo. Varios colegas de trabajo. Several colegas de trabajo. Several co-workers, right? Varios colegas de trabajo. What if you work alone? Then you can forget con and just say trabajo solo. Trabajo solo. Let's look at a couple more questions before we finish up here. ¿Qué días trabajas? ¿Qué días trabajas? Or perhaps the person asks more generally, ¿cuándo trabajas? Now, either one of these questions, ¿qué días trabajas o cuándo trabajas, is going to tend to elicit the day of the week, right, rather than the time, right? Because if they wanted to ask the time, they would ask, ¿a qué horas trabajas, right? Right? All right. So, ¿qué días trabajas? I might answer this with, or ¿cuándo trabajas? I might answer this with something like, trabajo, and then it's wide open. Trabajo de lunes, if I work the regular work week, a viernes. Trabajo de lunes a viernes. Trabajo de lunes a viernes. Trabajo on weekends, los fines de semana. Trabajo los fines de semana. Or if I want to say that I work on specific days, again, I'm going to use los. Trabajo los jueves, viernes y domingos. Okay. Entonces, ¿qué días trabajas? Trabajo de lunes a viernes. I work weekends. Trabajo los fines de semana. I work, for example, Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Trabajo los jueves, viernes y domingos. All right. ¿Qué días trabajas? All right. One more question here. ¿Cuántas horas trabajas? How many hours do you work? Right? The person gets really curious. How many hours do you work? They might even break it down by saying something like, how many hours do you work per day? Or how many hours do you work a la semana? ¿Cuántas horas trabajas a la semana, per week? Or on a particular day? ¿Cuántas horas trabajas los sábados? All right? So we're just going to, I don't know if we can get these in frame here. Right, answer this by saying, again, conjugating trabajar in the present tense, yo form, trabajo, and then however many hours it is, right? Trabajo 8 horas por día, right? O trabajo 6 horas los sábados. O trabajo 40 horas a la semana. Trabajo 40 horas, tiempo completo, right? Trabajo 40 horas a la semana. All right, that concludes Lesson 7 in my series on asking and answering basic questions in Spanish. I hope you found it to be informative and useful. As always, I welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions, so if you do have a moment, please leave me a comment and let me know what you thought about this particular video lesson. I always appreciate hearing from you. Remember, you can find lots more Professor Jason content right here or over at my website, professorjason.com. I'd also invite you to like my Facebook community and to follow me on Twitter, and I'll put that information up on the screen here in just a minute. Once again, thank you for watching. It's been Professor Jason, your guide to Spanish, and I'll see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.